Episode 31. I Can Please You. In 2 strikes, Cain managed to put a huge hole in the stone wall, letting chunks and big rocks crumble to the ground of the tunnel.
In this.
Iris said, as she knelt down and grabbed a huge rock before giving it to Cain.
There's a magic stone inside.
How do you know that?
Adoran couldn't help but ask. This simply didn't make any sense to him. Iris shook her head.
I don't know. I just know there is one in it.
She couldn't explain why she knew because it was almost like a second nature to her to know about these magic stones. She could feel a lot of magic stones in this tunnel, but it would take them years to dig all of them out. The feeling was so strong, and this overwhelmed her, almost making her slightly dizzy.
It doesn't make any sense.
Adoran shook his head and then took the rock that Cain handed over to him. He couldn't crush it the way he did the stone wall because he could accidentally break the precious stone inside. They needed a tool to get it out.
You can go back to your room.
And that was it. Cain just left like that. He didn't talk about what Iris had witnessed in the library, but she was not stupid enough to run her mouth about that matter. It was something that didn't concern her. Whether Cain was behind the affair between the Queen and Adoran or not, she was not involved with that plot, and she didn't think she wanted to be part of it. To survive in her current status as a slave was already hard enough for her. She didn't need to put herself in more trouble. However, 3 days later, the alphas from the 5 packs started to arrive in the Blue Moon pack. All the preparations to welcome them had been done, and this pack became lively once again. Iris heard that those alphas wanted to see her. Now her father was not there to tell him off because he didn't like them seeing his runt of a daughter. She couldn't avoid meeting them, especially when she received a direct order from the alpha himself. She felt dreadful. The welcoming party was not a decent party where you would get only nice wine and scrumptious food, also some amusement, but it could go very wild and wrong, which involved so many sex activities where they would let their animal instincts get the better of them. In the past, when her father and brother occasionally held a party for those 5 alphas, she sneaked out one time, and what she witnessed was something that she didn't think she would be able to see again for the second time. Iris didn't want to go to such a party. It was too cruel and sadistic for her taste. If she could, she would rather work herself to death than to participate in that party. She herself was trembling in fear when she had to head toward the alpha's bedroom. The things in the party that she had seen years ago replayed in her mind on a repeat. Cain watched her walk into the room. She was wearing a white dress that was in contrast with her auburn hair. She let her long and curly hair cascade down her chest. Her blue eyes looked so gloomy. It was easy to say that she was very reluctant to come. But she looked delightful to the eyes when her face was not covered with soot and her hair was not so messy. She had heart-shaped lips and a pointed nose. Coupled with her big blue eyes, she could be easily the most beautiful woman in the room. Those alphas were so curious about her, since it was a rare occasion to see her, even though she was living in the pack house, because Gerald would always reject their demand to bring her out.
The 5 alphas and the king will be there.
Cain said as he stood up from his seat and approached her. He stared at her with those impassive eyes, which looked so dark. Iris fiddled with her fingers and only mumbled, "Okay." This would be the first time for her to have really participated in the party and witness up close how they indulged themselves in such occasions. Iris remembered every day during the party was held, the smell of sex and alcohol could be sensed from outside of the pack house. It was stifling. Screams and more screams would ring out during the event for days without stopping. Slaves died during that time to entertain those alphas and those people who were born privileged, and that was not a big deal at all. Alpha Cain must be there for every hellish party, since Gerald and Mason loved him so much, they didn't want him to miss it.
We need to leave now.
Kane ignored how strong her reluctance to move. But when he walked out of the room and she didn't follow, he turned around and faced her.
Should I drag you to the main hall myself?
Iris was staring at him. Thus, she caught what he was saying to her.
Can I do something else?
At least she needed to try. Though the chance of the Alpha agreeing to it was very slim to none. Kane watched how she stumbled with her words to convince him not to take her, but she didn't have anything to offer him.
I will find more magic stones for you.
Iris said. She was trying so hard to think of her usefulness, but in the end, she was helpless.
I will do everything you tell me to do, but please, I don't want to be there.
Iris's heart sank when she watched how callous Kane was. He didn't sympathize with her plea. But then, why should he? He must have pleaded the same thing to her father, but Gerald would have laughed in his face.
I can
Iris tried to find the right thing to say.
I can please you.
She lowered her head as her cheeks burned.
Episode 32.
The Welcoming Party 2.
I can please you.
Iris lowered her head. Her cheeks burned. She must have gone crazy and be beyond desperate to be able to propose something like that. But then, it would be better for Kane to be the only man who ever touched her, rather than to be exchanged among the Alphas for their pleasure. Because that was what they usually did to the slaves, and she was one of them right now. She watched how a slave got raped until she died miserably before. She'd seen the pain on her face and how her eyes slowly dimmed as life snuffed out of her. This was only a fraction of the things that she remembered when she witnessed the party years ago. Meanwhile, all the Alphas laughed at the slave's agony and simply tossed her body away to be replaced by someone else. It was so callous, as if their lives meant nothing. And there was a high possibility that Iris would have to endure the same thing. She was a slave now, a war prisoner, a slave for Kane nonetheless. The thought of it alone turned her throat dry. She would rather have Kane torture her than to go inside that den of hungry and obscene shifters. Iris knew them since her father's reign. Thus she knew what kind of fate was waiting for her at their hands. Now she was no longer the Alpha's daughter, and was just a slave of the new conqueror.
Please, Alpha, you can torture me.
Iris fell to her knees. She begged him now, because her fear was so strong. She couldn't bring herself to enter such a room where only lustful eyes could be seen everywhere. That disgusted her.
Torture you? Do you even know what you are asking for?
Kane's cold eyes fell on her, and she couldn't bear to look into them. But then she needed to know what he was saying. Thus she looked at his lips instead. Her whole body was shaking.
Please, Alpha, I don't want...
Iris stopped herself. She knew what Howling Wolf Pack had gone through under her father's hands. They must have begged him this way as well when they were forced to do something so abhorrent. They didn't want to do it, but did her father care about that? The answer was crystal clear. Thus, why would Alpha Kane care about what she wanted or didn't want? However, instead of throwing that fact at her face, Kane approached her. He looked down at her as he spoke. Kane grabbed her arm and then pulled her up.
Bear with it.
What he said didn't help her feel better. She could feel her stomach churning uncomfortably as she followed his footsteps. He let her go once they were out of the bedroom.
You will come, whether you walk through the door, or I will ask someone to drag you in.
Kane didn't raise his voice, but his intention was clear. He was serious about what he said. Iris wiped her tears from her cheeks. Her father and brother found it annoying to see her cry. Thus she stopped herself from crying and gritted her teeth. Compared to what he had gone through, this was nothing. It was nothing. Stop thinking, it will be over soon. Iris then tried to remember what Hannah said about how she couldn't fight back because they would hurt her even more if she resisted. She needed to let them do whatever they wanted to her, or else they would find her amusing, writhing in pain, since that was what entertained them the most. She needed to stay still and should not show her reluctance, let them get bored with her. On the other hand, Cain glanced at her over his shoulder before he entered the main hall, where the 5 alphas and the king had been waiting. For shifters, a party would always mean sexual pleasure, the time when they truly became animals. Cain despised this so much. However, in his current condition, no matter how disgusted he was by it, he still had to please them with such a party, so they wouldn't go against him openly, at least, not yet. He couldn't confront them when he was not strong enough. It would be a reckless move. Everything took time, and he needed to create a stronghold first before he launched an attack.
The Alpha of the Howling Wolf Pack and his slave enter the room.
The guard announced their arrival, and for a moment, the cheerful laughter quieted down, as their attention was on Cain and Iris. Iris felt her heart beat in her throat when she walked in on the obscene sight before her eyes. Women were naked as they laughed coquettishly to satisfy their masters. They didn't seem ashamed at all with their nudity, since all of them were almost naked. They tried their best to be their master's favorite, because as a personal slave like them, their master's affection was the only way for them to survive, since they could be killed for even a trivial mistake and were easily replaceable. Moans and groans and pleasure filled the room, as the smell of sex permeated from every living being here. This was 1,000 times worse than when Iris caught the Queen and Adoran having an affair. At least they did it one-on-one. But what was happening here was beyond depraved. Each alpha had at least 5 slaves to satisfy him. Even the king wouldn't keep his hands off the few slaves that surrounded him. They would exchange those slaves with one another to make things more interesting, and of course, the beautiful ones would have a hard time with those alphas, as they would want to have them for themselves. Arya used to be the favorite slave in every party, since she looked so beautiful with a voluptuous body and her sun-kissed skin. However, knowing Iris would be at the party, Arya didn't want to be here. It brought back a lot of trauma and harsh memories to her, and she deemed it not worth it. She would hear what happened from the slaves or servants. That was enough.
So this is Gerald's daughter. I saw her one time 6 years ago, and now she is a woman already.
Episode 33, The Welcoming Party, 3. Outside the main hall, those high-ranking and important warriors who were in charge of guarding the place would have their share of slaves and wine as well. Therefore, this pack house was filled with so many obscene scenes and scents. Most of the pack members would lock themselves inside their houses during this time because they didn't want to accidentally get involved in this party. They dreaded them. Meanwhile, inside the hall, where the alphas and the king were, music was playing softly, along with their moans. Pairs of eyes watched Iris lustfully. As they received pleasure from their slaves and mistresses, their eyes were fixed on her. There was no need to confirm what kind of disgusting thoughts that they had in their heads. This feeling was too much for Iris. She recoiled and pressed her body against Alpha Cain, as if he was the only safest place for her in this den of hungry wolves. However, it was ironic to remember that it was Cain who had brought her to this place and offered her to be savored by those beasts. Cain frowned when he felt her body so close to him, but he didn't shove her away. Instead, he walked towards his chair on the king's left side, while Iris knelt down beside Cain's chair, lowering her head until she kissed the floor, waiting for further instruction. All the slaves inside this room would have to do the same thing when they were not being used by their alphas or masters. That was the place where a slave should be, so low on the floor, kissing the ground their masters walked on.
You are late.
The king stated, and Cain simply nodded and apologized for his tardiness.
What is it? You have to coax your little slave first.
King Aeon looked half drunk with a naked woman on his lap, nibbling on his earlobe. On the other hand, Cain didn't answer that question and let him think whatever he wanted.
Let's start this.
Alpha Gil from Riverside Pack was so eager to see Iris. He was the one who had proposed for this girl to be one of his mistresses when she turned 15. He saw her accidentally and was enamored by her beauty. He couldn't wait to have a taste of her. Or maybe he could ask Cain for a compromise and take this runt for himself.
This will be your first slave, Alpha Cain.
He chortled at Cain, as if he had forgotten what he had done to him in this very room.
Let's strip her. Strip her naked.
Alpha Darian from Crystal Moon Pack backed it up, followed by all degrading demands from the rest of the alphas in this room, while all the slaves' eyes were on Iris, who recoiled at their demanding voice. Her body was trembling as she started to whimper.
Make her dance for us. I want to see how much she has grown up. Strip her dress. I want to see her body.
Iris couldn't hear what they said, but from what she sensed and how excited these people were, she knew that they demanded her to do something.
Please, please.
She whimpered. But then she felt Cain reach out to her as he lifted her head. She read his lips, and a tear escaped from the corner of her eyes.
They are asking you to take your dress off.
Cain looked so callous and cold when he said that, as if all of his compassion had been wrung out of him. He was nothing but another heartless alpha.
You will get used to it.
Iris pleaded with her eyes, but it didn't reach him at all, because when one of the alphas grabbed her arm and yanked her away, he did nothing. Instead, he sipped his alcohol as if there was nothing happening. Meanwhile, Iris was too afraid and at a loss to say anything. Her whole body was trembling, fighting back her tears as she remembered what Hannah said to not give them pleasure from torturing her, because that was what they liked, and it would only prolong their interest in her. She needed to numb her feelings, but every cell in her body could feel it. She was dreadful. It was Alpha James from Bloody Wolf Pack who caught her arm and threw her to the middle of the room, while the other alphas cheered from the side. They circled her and threw degrading remarks about what they were going to do with her body, as her fear excited them. Hannah was right. They couldn't wait to see her body.
Strip!
Alpha Gil screamed impatiently, while the woman gave him pleasure with her mouth, but his eyes never left Iris.
I want to see her body under that shabby dress.
All the alphas and the kings sat on their seats on the side as they watched her intensely. Alpha James gave Iris a wolfish grin. He didn't know that Iris couldn't hear what he was saying.
Don't you hear that? They want to see your body. Now you are only a slave. You should do what your master wants you to do.
Impatient, James stood up and approached her. He grabbed her dress and ripped it apart in one swift movement, which elicited cheers from all the people there. Iris muffled her scream as she immediately knelt down and covered her nudity with her arms and her long hair. Thankfully, her hair was long enough to cover her skin, but it wouldn't do much to protect her if they really wanted her. All the alphas laughed at her predicament and how she tried to avoid Alpha James' attempt to touch her.
She is a runt. I want to see whether a runt will be able to give the same satisfaction.
Alpha Gian from Silver River Pack spoke in delight to see the sight before his eyes. She looked so fine, and even though all of them were friends with Gerald and mostly did such abhorrent acts with him, he was dead now, and there was no respect for each other since the very beginning. Therefore, They didn't even hesitate to fuck Gerald's daughter for pleasure. Actually, they had been waiting for this. It was fair for them, after all. As long as you were in power, you can do whatever you please.
No, please, Alpha James.
Iris had known him for years before this. Even though she was not her father's favorite child, her status always protected her. But right now, there was nothing that could protect her from their demeaning ways. She cried when Alpha James held both of her arms behind her back, which exposed her well-developed breasts. They roared disgustingly to see her pinkish nipples. Iris forgot what Hannah said about remaining silent and staying still, because right now, she was shaking like a leaf to see such a reaction from them. Episode 34, The Welcoming Party. All the alphas cheered at what James was doing. Even the king was laughing at the scene before his eyes. They were going crazy at this, especially when it was Gerald's only daughter, whom he had kept hidden for a long time. To see her grow up into a beautiful woman and ready for them to feast hyped them up further.
Look at those perky nipples. I want to wrap my mouth around them. She has her mother's beauty.
All of them agreed. Gerald made his own destined mate to be his mistress, while taking Iris's mother to be the Luna of the pack. That was the extent of Gerald's craziness among the many other things. Iris was trembling in fear when James' callous hand fondled her breasts. She tried to thrash her body, but it was hard in her current position. James pulled her closer. Thus, she could touch his hardness with her hands that he held behind her back, while his other hand fondled her breasts. He licked her ear and nibbled on her earlobe. The feeling of his hardness in her palms repulsed her, and she thought she wanted to vomit right there and then. Would he let her go when she covered herself with her own vomit? The thought crossed Iris's mind. She couldn't stop crying, while her body rejected his advances greatly. Iris turned her head to the side and caught Kane's dark eyes. He was staring at her, but there was no emotion whatsoever in those dark eyes. He was so cold, as if he had cut all the connection that he had to reality and was deep in his own thoughts. Kane stared at her predicament, but he wasn't really looking at her. This was nothing for him, for he had gone through the worst.
Please, please.
Iris pleaded. She whispered the words through the sobs that wrecked her body, which was now under the possession of Alpha James. He caressed her inner thighs now, feeling good with himself because he got the first chance to try her. His fingers now rubbed her womanhood, as the others cheered him to make her come. Just close your eyes and stay still. All of this will be over soon. Iris talked to herself, trying hard to numb her feelings. This will be over soon. When it is over, you can pretend like it has never happened. That was what she said to herself. However, no matter how hard she tuned out her own feelings, she couldn't help this disgusting thought that crawled on her skin. She wanted to push him away. A whimper escaped her lips when she felt the pre-cum on the tip of his phallus and his hot and erratic breath against her shoulder while he kept rubbing her intimate part. She didn't feel pleasure. She felt pain. Her heart was in her throat, beating in her ears. But then, it stopped. James moved away from her body, and her hands were free again. Iris immediately opened her eyes and sank to the floor. She found people's attention was not on her anymore, but a person who was standing near the door. And it was her brother. This was the first time for Iris to see her brother after the pack had fallen into Alpha Kane's hands, and she was almost unable to recognize him. He looked battered and horrid. But all of their main focus was on his private part that had been chopped off. He was stark naked, standing near the door with Gamma Ethan right behind him. He was holding a leash to Mason's neck, as if he was some kind of dog. Iris's first instinct was to look for Kane, but he was nowhere to be seen. Her heart lurched to her stomach when she realized that she was alone in this room. But then she caught a glimpse of him leaving the room. Their eyes met, but there was nothing that he said. He just held her gaze for 2 long seconds before he exited the room through the back door. Iris then looked around her frantically, realizing that Mason was crawling on the ground while Ethan threw a treat on the floor so he could get it with his mouth, eating straight from the ground. All of them laughed, and for a moment, they forgot about her existence, amused by the sight of a young man who once upon a time couldn't live without sex, but now had to lose his manhood and was treated like a mutt as he acted like one. This was the entertainment that they loved at every party. Iris scrambled away and ran out of the room. It was only the king who saw her, but he said nothing when she exited from the same door that Kane used. If the king wanted to help her by feigning ignorance of her little escape, he surely had done her a great favor. But then, Iris was still naked. It was only her long, curly hair that covered her body. The guards ogled at her, but some of them politely turned their heads away and found the sky more interesting than her nudity, which she was thankful for. Iris was not sure where she needed to go, but then there was an old lady that approached her.
"Come here,"
she said as she draped a long cloak around her shoulders. The cloak covered her perfectly, and she was no longer exposed for those eyes to see. It felt warm, and she felt safe. This was the first time for Iris to feel so emotional over a cloak and such kindness. Thus, she ended up crying. She held the cloak so tight to her body, as if she was holding on to her life.
There.
The old lady patted her back and guided her to one of the rooms as she sat her down on the bed. Iris recognized this was one of the bedrooms for guests. They had a lot in this pack house, since her father loved to hold parties and have fun with his fellow immoral alpha friends to enjoy such entertainment.
"I will bring you hot tea. You will feel better after having some,"
the old woman said, but Iris missed it. Her vision was blurry because of the tears that welled up in her eyes. She couldn't stop shaking. She felt so dirty when she remembered the way Alpha James touched her and how they looked at her like she was a piece of juicy meat full of lust. Episode 35, Howling in the Distance. Ethan hated it that he had to go to this welcoming party, but then he had a cute mutt ready to be introduced to those obscene alphas, and he thought it would be a great experience for the mutt to be finally put in his position. Thus, with his happy-go-lucky personality, he entered the main hall with his mutt and showed them what Mason could do. He even put a leash around his neck and forced him to crawl on the floor to get a treat. Mason didn't have any other choice but to swallow his pride, if he still had any. He crawled per Ethan's instructions, since this crazy Gamma had starved him for 5 days straight. He was barely able to walk. The humiliation and anger were unbearable, seeing those familiar faces laughing at his downfall. They wouldn't have dared to laugh at his face if his father was still here. However, he was too hungry to get angry. Ethan enjoyed the show. So did the rest of the alphas and the king.
This is just the beginning.
Ethan whispered into Mason's ear.
I will give you the taste of your own actions down to the very little detail.
It was Jace who was treated this way when he was taken to the party for the first time by Alpha Gerald. He put a leash on his neck and made him crawl on the floor to get a treat by his mouth, or else Kane would be whipped. Jace did it, but Kane still got whipped.
Where is the girl?
After the show, they finally realized that Iris was no longer inside the room, and Alpha Kane had disappeared as well. They were mad, but then Ethan threw Mason to them.
I think her brother will do for now.
Ethan dragged Mason to the table and laid him down.
I still remember that he hated it when someone did his back.
All the 5 alphas laughed. A few slaves laughed along with their masters. So did the king. But when the actual act happened, the king left the room. It didn't suit his palate. Moreover, he was tired, since his slaves had made him come a few times. He was satisfied enough. It was time to look for his queen. Ami checked on Iris when she returned with tea and a meal. She was sleeping, and knowing that she needed rest after such a horrible event, she left the meal there. It seemed she was in a great shock because of what Alpha James had done to her and how those people looked at her degradingly. But she didn't have a fever. She would check on her again later, just in case she would catch one. Ami was Rora and Edgar's wet nurse, the Alpha's twin siblings, also their nanny. She had been in the family for a long time. During those hard times, she would be the one who pushed him to go through day after day and keep strong, for he couldn't let Gerald laugh at his death. Though it was hard, thanks to her, Kane could keep a little bit of his sanity intact.
I will go now.
Kane said as he gulped down the tea that Ami brought for him and stood up. Kane looked a little bit pale. It was only a few hours before midnight, and he was feeling restless already. He started to feel pain, as if his whole body was being pricked by thousands of silver needles. Yet, despite what he felt, he didn't show it on his face at all. He still looked calm and distant. There was a heavy cloud of sadness in Ami's eyes when she watched Kane's retreating back, as she knew he would receive the retribution for his actions, the price for his pack's freedom. Every new moon, every month, he would be in agony that none of them could imagine. There were a lot of things that happened, and a lot of sacrifices before they could free themselves from the tyrant's grip. Things that shouldn't be said or talked about. Ami's heart ached every time the new moon came, and Kane had to be away from all the people for his own sake, and the others, taking the brunt all by himself. Iris woke up around midnight. She kept hearing a howl in the distance, though it was not possible, and that must be only in her mind. She opened her eyes groggily and took in her surroundings. She was sure that she was not in her room, and when she tried to pinpoint where she was, all the memories about what happened earlier that day flooded her mind, and she couldn't help but tremble in fear again.
You are okay. You are fine. You're fine.
Iris talked to herself, hugging her knees as she looked around in alert, afraid that one of the alphas would suddenly appear and touch her again, since they would still be in the pack house for another 6 days. When Iris managed to get a little grip over her emotions, she found a tray of food on the table, not too far from her, and a new dress on the bed. She just realized that she was naked under the cloak, it seemed. She cried herself to sleep, and that old lady had brought her food and a dress while she was sleeping. Would she be all right to do this for her? Wouldn't the alpha be angry? But then, she was too famished to care about that, at least for now. Gingerly, Iris got off the bed and headed for the food. It was already cold, but there was meat there, and she didn't mind it. It was a nice meal, though it was no longer warm. In the end, Iris helped herself and ate everything on the table gleefully. But then, the howling in the distance wouldn't stop bothering her. It sounded so pitiful, as if someone was in pain. And what was more, it felt like they were calling for her.